Hey everyone, this is Ben, and what we're going to do today is talk about a question that I realize I've never actually talked about before. And it is an apologetics question, and I think it's raised actually in the Da Vinci Code movies, maybe? I don't know. So this is how it works. The idea is that there was actually a whole lot of different gospels and a whole lot of that told the story of Jesus. So if you don't know, the Gospels are the books of the Bible, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they tell the story of Jesus. And the idea is that there were like these other Gospels that told the story of Jesus, and they told a different version of the story. And that would actually be evidence against the version of Christianity we believe in. So like, let's just kind of give a hypothetical example, and then compare that to, I guess, the historical evidence we have. Like, let's just use the resurrection for an example. Let's say that there are like written eyewitness accounts that said that Jesus didn't rise from the grave, that they found the body, they had the body, and that happened, and that those accounts were just like destroyed and suppressed by like the Council of Nicea or some centuries later, when the Roman Empire like unified with like the church, or made the church the Christian church like the official state religion. It was suppressed. The truth about Jesus was suppressed, or at least the alternative views were suppressed. So let's take a look at that, I guess. Where do we begin? Well, we begin with a very simple. What we want to do is understand why this is relevant. And to understand that, let's think a little bit. I know I've talked about this in a million other videos and a million other times, but let's think about, like, what is the historical evidence for the resurrection? Well, the historical evidence for the resurrection, essentially, if like we can put it down to bare bones, it works very similar to how all historical evidence works. What you do is you say, do we have multiple independent accounts that support a particular fact of history, or support a particular idea? And if they do, and they're close to the time of the writing, especially like eyewitness accounts, then it probably happened. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it would mean that like the evidence indicates that it happened. So like the example I always give is something like, let's say that someone told you that the Bible didn't exist before 1990. Okay, so the Bible didn't exist before 1990, and in the 80s we didn't have the Bible. So the problem with that is that everyone knows tons and tons of people that would testify to you that the Bible totally existed in the 80s. So if you want to believe that it didn't exist before 1990, then you would have to say that there's like millions of people who were all in on the big conspiracy, on the big scam, to suppress the evidence. And so when it comes to this, that's kind of, I don't know how to sum this up correctly, but that's the idea. So the core concept there is that, like, if everyone's making up their own lie, then like they wouldn't have a consistent story. And the only way you can explain a consistent story is if everyone gets together and agrees on a consistent story. And so the only way you can have a consistent story that's made consistent but also isn't true, I mean, the truth can make a story consistent because people are just telling the truth, so the truth becomes like a unifying factor there. But like, you could have a consistent story with like a conspiracy, where like everyone gets together and conspires together to put out a fake story, and they that's how it works. But like, the more and more and more and more and more evidence you bring to bear, in other words, the more witnesses, the more sources, the more testimony you have towards a particular position, then the more unlikely it is that that position is incorrect, or that that they're making it up. Because the bigger the conspiracy is, the more unlikely it is that it's a conspiracy. And the other way you can explain away a conspiracy is with something called the legendary idea, with a legend. So like, you could say that like there was actually only one source long ago, and all of the sources we now have for like whatever happened, they were written down centuries later. All right, so first of all, the real scholarly debate over, whether or not Jesus really existed, whether or not the resurrection happened, that kind of thing, the real scholarly debate is actually regarding, let's see, how you say, the legendary hypothesis. Like, when were the Gospels written down? Okay, and when the other accounts that we have, the other accounts in the New Testament, and then the non-Christian sources. We have a lot of sources, like, for the existence of Jesus. And then, of course, we only have Christian sources for the resurrection, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to have a non-Christian source for the resurrection. But anyway, so you see how this works. And so, if you understand that, then you could say, like, okay, well, what if there were tons of other sources? What if there were, like, tons of, like, other things that, were constructed, so like, what if there were other gospels and other writings, or, maybe not even gospels, maybe they were just writings of the Pharisees or whoever who said, like, no, we've got the body right here. You guys who are saying that Jesus, rose from the grave, y'all are making it up. We provided the body. What if there were, like, tons of other such sources? But all of that information and all of those sources were either, lost to the ravages of time, and maybe the early Christians just published their sources all around the world, way more. And then later on, the other information was just suppressed by, like, the Roman government. Okay, so that's what we call a conspiracy theory. In other words, I guess, so that's the theory. And so that hopefully, before I move into debunking that theory, I hope that I've made the case that, like, how powerful it is for people. And so, for some people, that just makes a lot of sense. They're like, yeah, it was suppressed. And there was just like a Christian group that just, forced their view down everyone's throats. And let's just move to debunking it. Essentially, debunking this is not really a lot different from a lot. This is a situation where this is called, I hate to say this, but in logic, this is called a burden of proof fallacy, shifting of the burden of proof. In other words, like, there's no reason to believe that this book burning and this suppression happened unless you can provide evidence that it happened. Currently, all of the evidence suggests that, the other side of the story, I guess, I don't know how to put it, but all of the evidence suggests that Jesus existed. We have the New Testament evidence. All of the evidence suggests one view. And then you want to come in with this other view that, like, well, there was actually, people found the body. Like, so, for example, one thing that's uncontested from the non-Christian sources and the Christian sources alike is that the tomb was empty. So everyone agrees on that the tomb was empty. And so the non-Christian sources just say that the disciples stole the body. And so you run into a question about, the trustworthiness of the disciples. And the Christian sources say that Jesus resurrected. So the issue here is that we just have no sources that say, actually, we found the body. They just don't exist. We don't have them. And if you want to say that those were all suppressed or destroyed, well, like, we have no reason to believe that that happened until you provide evidence that that happened. Could it have happened? Yes. But we have zero evidence for that. None. And that's the key point I want to make. So, like, let's just switch this around to, like, the same concept in, like, a different situation. Let's say that I tell you, this is the example I always use. Let's just say that on Tuesday nights I play, poker with, like, Bigfoot and Abraham Lincoln, and I have no evidence that I have no evidence that it happened, but it actually did happen. And since you can't prove to me that I don't do that I don't have that poker game on Tuesdays, then that means that I do. You see, so, like, when it comes to historical evidence or scientific evidence in other areas, like, we follow the logical system. The philosophical basis is what's called inductive reasoning, which means that, like, all of the evidence leads us to conclusion A. We have zero evidence that leads us to conclusion B. Therefore, we proceed forward as though A is true. Does it mean that we know for a fact beyond the shadow of a doubt that A is true? No. And that's why in videos where I talk about where I've got videos called The Proof Christianity is True, I talk about historical evidence, but then I move beyond that to, more certain forms of evidence, or proof really that are more important. But it's important to understand that like this idea that that the Council of Nicea, they suppressed all these other versions of Christianity. There's just nothing to back that up. That's just a complete fantasy that you're making up, and there's no reason, there is no basis in fact for you to say that. You're just saying, well, it could have happened, and you can't prove that it didn't happen, so that means that it did. Okay, it's like another example might be the people who say that cell phones cause cancer. There's just no evidence that they do. There's just none. Like, so the only reason you believe that they do is just because you're biased towards believing that they do. You're not getting that from the evidence because there's no evidence to support that. So when this idea, I guess, of the Da Vinci Code idea that like the true version of Christianity was suppressed, you're just pulling that out of thin air. You might as well tell me that anything. You can make up absolutely any wacky story and say that like it's true and have no evidence to support it, and it would just magically be true. So like I could tell you that like there's a 5,000 foot long anaconda under the White House, and you don't know that it's not there, so like that means that it's there, and then someone else could say that no, there's a 5,000 foot long lizard and it's not an anaconda, and like, but that other guy, he also has no evidence to support his thing. So like, I mean, you would have to think about all the things you would have to wind up believing if you started believing in things that you had no evidence for. Because like, there's actually an infinite number of things that we have no evidence for. Like the animal under the White House example, I could come up with like an infinite variety of that, of just things that like we don't know that they don't exist, so that means that they do exist, or we don't know that that didn't happen, so that means that it did. Like you would have to believe in anything. Like I could come to anyone and manipulate anyone and just say like, this happened, and I have no proof that it happened, I have no evidence that it happened, but because you can't prove that it didn't happen, that means that it did. No, that just means that we don't know. And as far as like what's likely to happen, we go with what the evidence that we actually have indicates. So, is it possible that we find these lost gospels one day and they debunk like Christianity kind of thing? That is possible, but the problem with that is that all the evidence we have indicates otherwise. In fact, there's counter evidence that like indicates that didn't happen. That that would lean towards it not happening. In other words, there were heretical movements like Gnosticism. Like Gnosticism said that Judas was the real apostle, and that all the other apostles were losers, and like Jesus, it preaches like a totally different form of Christianity, and it doesn't disagree with like Jesus being crucified, but it says that like his spirit like rose out of his body before it happened, and they have their own gospels, their own teachings, their own writer. They had their own religious movement, and the problem is that like it's not like a forgotten movement. It died out, but like it just wasn't this like there was no suppression of it. In fact, it arose and died out, for example, before Christianity ever had a chance to suppress it. In other words, like it rose and died out the first time in southern France, and there was just the church didn't have the political power. It was illegal to be a Christian at that time, and there just was no way to suppress it. And all of the evidence indicates that it was dealt with by a guy named Irenaeus, who wrote a book called Against Heresies, or a letter, and he just argued with the teachings of Gnostics and made quotations from the New Testament, just debunking, saying how this disagrees with like the accepted books of the New Testament. And the thing about accepted books of the New Testament is like the Gnostics claim that like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 1 Corinthians, stuff like that, they claim that those were like their books too. So like there were competing ideas, there were alternative ideas. I mean, think about the fact that like the Romans even had alternative ideas about Jesus. They said that he was just a criminal and just a man that they executed, and that the reason no one found the body is because it was hidden or destroyed or something by scoundrels. So like that version of Christianity, that's just one example. We could talk about the Gnostics, or we could talk about the Romans version of Christianity, where they said it was a bunch of bunk and you shouldn't believe it. Like, So I guess that sums it up. Like, it's just like the fact that we have contrary versions of Christianity that were just never lost to history would be a powerful indication that the suppression didn't happen, on top of the fact that we have no evidence that the suppression happened. And then beyond all of that, is it possible that the suppression happened? Yes. But is it likely? No. It's just more likely that it did not happen. The more evidence you pile for side A, the more and more unlikely side B becomes. But does that prove A over B beyond the shadow of a doubt? No. And so that's where we get into other forms of proof that actually can go that far. Mathematical and logical proofs and different things like that. So anyway, I hope this video made some sense. Thank you for your time.